possible mechanism for synesthesia, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later today if I get to it, okay? Okay, this is good. I like these questions, but you know what happens when you ask me questions. I will go on and on and on. You'll have to throw something at me to stop me. So we'll take some questions. If I don't get to your questions, please, 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 please post them to the queries and comments board on B courses. That's what it's there for. You'll get a response from me within 1 business day. Okay, so for those of you who want to know what color blindness looks like, these are good examples of what I see. The color blindness actually comes in 3 forms. What's known as deuteranopia, where both reds and greens kind of look grayish. So that's one form. And here's tritanopia, where blues and yellows and purples look funny. Missed one. Protanopia here. Again, there are 3 basic forms, basically determined by the presence or absence of various color receptors in the retina. Let's make a long story short here. And you get these various combinations because of something that happens beyond the retina called opponent processes in color vision, where red and green and blue and yellow are paired up. Okay. That's all for an introductory psychology course or a more advanced course in vision. But there are good and sufficient reasons why these forms of color blindness occur. But if you want to know what the world looks like to somebody who has one of these, it basically looks like that. Okay, so that's qualia for now, anyway. Let's look at another aspect of consciousness, which is intentionality. This is James's 4th character of thought, that consciousness is always about something other than itself. We don't have pure states of consciousness. We're always conscious of something. And the philosophers call this the problem of intentionality. In English, intentionality has something to do with like what you intend to do, your goals. In philosophy, especially, or in German for that matter, or Latin, intentionality has a different kind of character to it, and it really has to do with what something is about. And the idea here is that consciousness is always, when you're conscious of particular kinds of things. Your consciousness has a kind of representational quality to it. Franz Brentano, 19th century the philosopher, argued that, in his words, intentionality is the mark of the mental, by which he meant that all mental states are intentional in nature. They are always about something other than themselves. I'm conscious of this computer. I'm conscious of your shuffling your feet. I'm conscious of this light coming from the projector. I'm always conscious of something. And the reverse, that only mental states are intentional. Only mental states are about something other than themselves. So presumably neural states are not intentional in the same way that mental states are. But the general idea here is that consciousness is representational. It's always about something. Bertrand Russell, another philosopher, kind of expanded Brentano's notion of consciousness with his idea of propositional attitudes. And he says, look, when you look at various mental states, what you usually find is that intentionality consists of some proposition about the world coupled with some attitude towards that proposition. And that attitude is one or another of these various mental states. So to take a familiar example, John believes that it is raining outside. John's mental state is one of belief, kind of like knowing, but really just believing that it's raining outside. But you would never say John believes. And you wouldn't say John thinks either exactly. It would be John believes it's raining outside, or John thinks it's raining outside, John feels that it's raining outside, or whatever. So that there's always this attitude of believing or knowing or thinking or perceiving or remembering or something like that, that links the person who has the mental state to what the person is conscious of, some proposition that has truth value to it. That is, it may or may not be raining outside, but John believes that it is raining outside, and you could go out and check and see whether that's the case. Now, Russell's analysis of intentionality is very popular, very influential, but I want you to notice a particular feature of it, which is that it's all about cognition. Okay? I just said you can't just believe. You can't just think. You have to believe something. You have to think something. But that's not necessarily the case with our other two categories, fundamental categories of mental life. So, for example, you can say John likes pizza. That is a statement about what I like and something about my emotion, and that has a kind of propositional attitude with it. But if you think about something like John is happy, there isn't any proposition there. Okay, there isn't anything other than happy. Or if we say John wants pizza, you kind of understand what there's kind of some implied proposition, maybe. But if I say John is hungry, there isn't any propositional content there either. So one of the interesting philosophical problems, one that we're not going to solve here, talk about a little bit in the lecture supplements, and people like Professor Searle have worked on quite a bit, is exactly what kind of intentionality is involved in various kinds of mental, non-cognitive mental states. We can't really say something like John believes or John thinks. That doesn't go right. It doesn't sound right. But we're quite happy to say things like John is happy. But you wouldn't say John feels. It's funny. Got to feel something, right? But it's not. Doesn't really seem to have the kind of propositional content that Russell is talking about. So there is an issue there, one that has been solved by some psychologists, notably Stanley Schachter and Jerome Singer in their famous cognitive constructivist theory of emotion, which basically says that our feelings and our desires are themselves reducible to beliefs. That is, that when we say something like John likes pizza, what we really mean to say is that John thinks he likes pizza, or John believes he likes pizza, which is not quite the same thing as John liking pizza. And even when we say John is happy, that's not right, okay? These are always reducible to cognitive states where John believes he's happy, but he might be wrong, okay? John believes he's hungry, but that might not actually be the case. Okay, so that's a little weird, okay? But you understand, what I want you to do is connect this with Kant. There are three irreducible faculties of mind: knowledge, feeling, and desire. These cognitive constructivist theories of emotion, and there's one of motivation too, basically deny that. They want to take emotional states and motivational states and reduce them to something like cognitive states. And there are fistfights at conventions about this kind of idea. Yeah. Well, if your emotional state really isn't an emotional state, but just a funny kind of cognition, okay? I'm looking at you right now, okay? Well, maybe I'm not. I mean, maybe my eyes go funny, or, my ears were wired up to my visual system or so on. So I'm really looking out there. But, so your experience, I mean, you could be wrong, and I could be wrong. I could be looking at this guy. We have this idea that you actually can't be wrong about your feelings or desires, and this basically says you can. You can be wrong, okay? And anybody who's ever had a fight with a significant other knows that we're always challenging people. So you don't really feel that way, You don't really want to break up with me. Yes, she does, right? Anyway, Okay, so qualia, intentionality. Let's look at a third aspect of consciousness that's particularly important, and that is subjectivity. One, again, that Professor Searle has talked about quite a bit. And this is the idea that conscious states are always experienced by somebody. And Searle has gone so far as to assert that conscious states exist only as they are experienced by some human or animal subject. And that's really what we mean when we say that consciousness is inherently a subjective experience. It doesn't make any sense to say that hunger is out there in the world someplace to be experienced by independent of somebody's experience. You gotta have somebody to do this kind of experience. And Searle has talked about a lot about this. And one of the points he makes, which I think is quite right, is that to talk about things being subjective or objective is often to obscure two quite different senses of the objective-subjective distinction. There is first what Searle calls the epistemic distinction between objective and subjective, which has to say that epistemology has to do with knowledge. So we're talking really about truth value here. And he points out, these are his examples, that there are some statements that are simply objectively true, okay? And for example, Rembrandt was born in 1606. That's just a statement of fact, okay? And there's really no getting around that. Contrast that with a statement like Rembrandt was the best Dutch painter ever, okay? That is not an objective statement of truth. That is a statement that is epistemically subjective, because it might be true for me, it might be true for him, but it might not be true for somebody else. They might think that Frans Hals is the best Dutch painter ever, or Vermeer is the best Dutch painter ever, or something like that. So there's this subjective-objective distinction that is an epistemic distinction that has to do with truth value. Is it true for everybody, objectively true, or is it true just for the individual, which would mean it's subjectively true? And then there is the ontological sense of the subjective-objective distinction, which is the one that Searle is particularly interested in, or what you might call first-person versus third-person ontology. There are some objects, there are some things that exist independent of any observer. And again, to use Searle's own examples, mountains, molecules, and tectonic plates are like that. If human beings or any creature never walked God's green earth, there would still be mountains, and there would still be molecules, and there would still be tectonic plates, regardless of whether there was anybody ever to experience them. But there are other things whose existence, whose ontological status is subjective, in the sense that they require for their existence that there be somebody to observe them, somebody to experience them. And again, to use his own examples, pains and tickles and suspicions and impressions. It doesn't make any sense to talk about these things, okay, except insofar as they're experienced by somebody else. So what we want to do here first is maintain this